Hello, students of Johnson University's Foundations in Theology class. This is your instructor, Dr. David Russell Mosley. This video, I promise, will be fairly short, because I really only wanted to talk about one thing when it comes to the Holy Spirit. And specifically, and again, this is another one of those cautionary ones where I'm going to caution us to be more humble, be open to more things. So, I know what Jack Cottrell's view is of spiritual gifts, especially gifts like tongues and prophecy and so on. Cottrell fits into the cessationist camp, as do many Christians within particularly Protestant non-charismatic denominations or non-denominations. I would caution you not to be cessationists. And I want to caution you on that for a few reasons. First and foremost, especially to go so far as some do, to suggest that if people are working spiritual gifts and if real effects are happening, that must be done by demonic power. Keep in mind that that's exactly what people said about Jesus, healing people and casting out demons. And Jesus then defines blasphemy, which he says there's, no salvation from, as ascribing the works of the Holy Spirit to demons. So we ought not to be quick to say that supernatural happenings involving human beings are the works of demons. Okay? It's like the primary thing that I want to say there. I want to provide two other reasons to potentially caution us on this. One of them is much, I think, surer than the other. The surer one, to an extent, is we often turn to 1 Corinthians for proof that spiritual gifts were meant to stop after the apostolic period or once we had the scriptures. And so we look at 1 Corinthians 13, and it says, and I don't hold that thought. I'll go get a copy of my Bible. Just look at my bookshelf for a moment, if you can even still hear me. Okay, I promised this video would be short, and then I walk away. All right. So look at 1 Corinthians 13, and it says. Words. 1 Corinthians 10, 11, 12, 13. So we often think of 1 Corinthians 13 as... Wait, no. Maybe it's 12. Okay. Give me a moment. Teach is given... No, I'm pretty sure it's 13. No, see, then, and now... Okay, I was right. It is 13. It's always best to probably prepare ahead of time, but I don't always do that. So, in 1 Corinthians 13, we of course think of it as the love chapter, but it's also the chapter, we ought to think of it because it's sandwiched between a chapter on spiritual gifts in chapter 12, and a chapter on prophecy and tongues in chapter 14. And basically what Paul is saying is that love is primary. But these gifts don't mean anything without love. And he says exactly that in the course of this. But he says in verse 8, love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, or when the perfect comes, depending on your translation, the partial will come to an end. And he continues on to say, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. Okay, so some people interpret that passage to mean that when the perfect comes, that is, when the Bible, when the canon, when the New Testament is done, there will no more be need for these things. Of course, it's highly problematic when it comes to knowledge, because we still know things. Of course, usually this is some kind of supernatural knowledge, but it doesn't actually say that. So that's already problematic. But the point is, so there's the word there is, I believe, tantaleon in Greek, or some other form of the word telos, perfect, complete, in Greek. And the thing is because it's an adjective, in that particular construction, it could be either masculine or neuter. So people who want to say it means the Bible will say, well, it's neuter, obviously, because it's an it. When it, the perfect, comes, then this one, well, that it must be the Bible. However, it could also be masculine, and I think that's the stronger reading. That what Paul is talking about there is when Christ comes, and really even when our own perfection comes, which will be when Christ returns. And I think that's made very evident by what he says in the rest of it, that when I was a child, I acted like a child, lived like a child. When I became an adult, I put away childish things. So we need to keep in mind, basically, is what I'm saying, that passage doesn't tell us that spiritual gifts are going to end when the Bible is done, or when the apostles die. It just simply doesn't say that. What it says is, those things will no longer be necessary when we see God face to face, because we'll be seeing God face to face, and there won't be need for that anymore. The other reason that I briefly, and I just really want to float this out there, and this is probably going to be controversial for some of you, but there are some kind of theological historians, you might call them, people who trace theological ideas through history, suggest that cessationism, as kind of an idea, is something that didn't come about until really quite late, well after the Protestant Reformation, and that part of the reason it came about was wanting to deny the activity of the Holy Spirit in the Roman Catholic Church. So basically, the idea is, we want to deny that spiritual gifts still exist, because if they did, we might have to take seriously some of the claims of the Roman Catholic Church. I think that's wildly problematic. Because as I've said in other videos, we share 1,500 years of history, of tradition, of foundation with the Roman Catholic Church. That is, we share that without separation, let alone the shared traditions and ideas that continued on after the Protestant Reformation. So we ought not to be quick to support particularly an idea that wants to say that God isn't active in another group of Christians. Remember, for those of you who are part of the Restoration Movement, remember that we are Christians only, but we are not the only Christians. I think there's a negative way to live that out, but I think there's a very positive way to live that out as well. And that is to remind us that God is just as active, and sometimes potentially even more so, in other traditions than our own. That it's not up to us to decide where God is active. And so I would caution then against cessationism, because as an idea, it seems to have come about for rather bad reasons. That is, it didn't seem to come about simply because of how we read the Bible, but is a relatively new idea. And I'm always very cautious of new ideas. Okay, so that's all. I promised this to be short. It's at least under 10 minutes. So, God bless, and I will see you all later.